The date was June 4th, 1943, and Wilhelm Hoffman sat in the mess hall at Camp Hearn, Texas, watching his hand shake. The spoon trembled between his fingers as he stared down at the plate in front of him, hardly believing what his eyes were seeing. Chunks of beef floated in rich stew, pieces larger than anything he'd eaten in his entire time in Africa. Fresh vegetables crowded the bowl, actually fresh, not rotting. White bread sat beside the plate, real bread made from wheat, not the sawdust mixture he'd grown accustomed to. And next to it all, a glass of milk so cold it seemed to shimmer in the Texas afternoon heat. None of this could possibly be real. That's what he wrote home to his mother in Hamburg, a letter that wouldn't reach her until December. "They must be showing us propaganda food," he explained. "Tomorrow we will get turnip water like everyone else." Around him in the mess hall, nearly 1,850 German prisoners from Rommel's defeated North Africa forces sat in stunned silence. These men had kept themselves alive on 200 grams of sawdust-filled bread and thin soup made from fodder beets. The portions before them now could have fed an entire Wehrmacht squad for 3 days. The sound of forks hitting metal trays had stopped completely. Some of the prisoners had tears running down their faces. Others sat motionless, frozen by the disconnect between what they saw and what they'd been told about starving, desperate America. What these soldiers couldn't grasp was that they were witnessing the sheer agricultural and industrial power of a nation that produced more food than it could eat, all while feeding 12 million men in uniform and sending 17 million tons of food to its allies around the world. This first meal would mark the beginning of something transformative, the slow collapse of every Nazi belief they held about American weakness, German superiority, and the inevitable triumph of the Third Reich. To truly understand what this abundance would do to these men psychologically, you had to first understand where they were coming from. By 1943, the German food system had broken down into a brutal hierarchy of hunger. Civilians back home were lucky to get 1,300 calories each day. Officers in the field were supposed to receive 3,600 calories, but hardly ever saw half that amount. In North Africa, where most of these prisoners had been captured, things had become truly desperate. Feldwebel Werner Müller, captured with the 21st Panzer Division in Tunisia, kept a diary that his family would preserve for generations. His final entry, written the day before he surrendered, read like the diary of a dying man. May 11th, 1943. One meal today, 150 grams of black bread that was mostly sawdust, 15 grams of rancid margarine, and soup made from one potato and desert weeds. The Italians have nothing. We are eating our horses. The Afrika Korps, once the Wehrmacht's greatest pride, had been reduced to skeletal men by the time of surrender. Rommel himself had sent desperate messages to Berlin about the impossible supply situation. Ships carrying food were sunk constantly by Allied planes and submarines. When supplies did arrive, the heat often spoiled them before they could be distributed. By early 1943, German soldiers in North Africa had begun showing signs of scurvy, beriberi, and protein deficiency diseases that Wehrmacht medical officers hadn't seen since the First World War. Oberleutnant Friedrich Bauer, a medical officer captured at Kasserine Pass, documented the deterioration in clinical detail. The men's gums bled all the time from scurvy. Vitamin A deficiency brought night blindness that affected 30% of the troops. Protein starvation swelled their legs with edema. "We had become an army of walking skeletons," he wrote. When surrender came in Tunisia on May 13, 1943, 275,000 Axis soldiers entered Allied captivity. Among them were Germany's military elite, veterans who had conquered France, pushed the British back to El Alamein, and believed absolutely in German racial superiority and American decadence. The first shock arrived almost immediately. At temporary collection points throughout North Africa, American quartermasters handed out C rations and K rations to the prisoners. These field rations, which American soldiers complained about constantly, looked like miracles to the starving Germans. Unteroffizier Karl Schmidt, captured with the 95th Light Division, couldn't quite believe what he was seeing. The Americans gave us small boxes they called K rations. Inside was more food than I had seen in 2 months, crackers that weren't moldy, a tin of meat that actually contained meat, chocolate, sugar, even cigarettes. They apologized that this was all they had. They apologized. The voyage to America aboard Liberty ships delivered the next revelation. These vessels were produced from American shipyards at a rate that German naval officers would have considered impossible. Rather than sail back empty after delivering supplies to Europe, they carried human cargo. The holds of these ships were hastily converted to transport German prisoners, and in those holds, the captured soldiers encountered American abundance in its most casual, everyday form. Gefreiter Hans Weber remembered years later how American sailors would throw away more food after meals than his entire company had eaten in a week. Whole loaves of white bread, barely touched, went straight into the garbage. Sailors complained about having chicken too often. One man crushed a chocolate bar under his boot because it had melted slightly. We fought with each other to dig through their garbage, Weber recalled. By August 1943, when the prisoners disembarked at Norfolk Naval Base in Virginia, they encountered a scene that shattered their understanding of wartime reality. Dock workers, many of them women and African Americans, people Nazi ideology said were incapable of skilled labor, unloaded ships while eating thick sandwiches full of meat and cheese. They drank Coca-Cola and threw the bottles away without a second thought. They smoked cigarettes continuously, stubbing them out when they were still half full. At the processing station, each prisoner went through a medical examination that included something they couldn't have imagined: vitamin supplements to address their nutritional problems. German medical officers, themselves now prisoners, worked alongside American doctors, treating malnutrition cases that looked more like victims from a death camp than enemy soldiers. Major William Patterson, a U.S. Army medical officer at Norfolk, documented the condition of the arrivals. The Germans came in severely malnourished. Average weight was 30 pounds below normal. Scurvy, pellagra, beriberi, diseases of starvation we'd only read about in medical textbooks. We started them immediately on a graduated feeding program to prevent refeeding syndrome. The train journey inland across America took 3 days, and it became an immersion in agricultural abundance. As the trains rolled through Virginia's Shenandoah Valley, prisoners pressed their faces against the windows, watching endless orchards heavy with apples, cornfields stretching to every horizon, dairy farms where cattle grazed fat and healthy. Every small town had grocery stores with windows full of products, restaurants advertising daily specials, ice cream parlors where lines of customers waited outside. The American POW camp system would eventually hold 425,000 German prisoners, with the peak population reaching 371,683 in May 1945. These men were spread across 700 camps in 46 states. Texas alone housed approximately 50,000 German POWs across multiple facilities, taking advantage of the state's climate, which the Geneva Convention said should match where the prisoners were captured. Camp Hearn, receiving some of the first Afrika Korps prisoners, had been built in just 4 months and could accommodate 4,800 POWs. It provided amenities that exceeded what most of these soldiers had known, even as civilians back home: electric lights, hot water, flush toilets, recreation halls, and most remarkably mess halls, serving 3 hot meals every single day. The menu from the first full day, June 5, 1943, was carefully recorded in camp documents. Breakfast included oatmeal with milk and sugar, scrambled eggs, bacon, toast with butter and jam, coffee with cream and sugar, and orange juice. Lunch offered vegetable soup, roast pork with gravy, mashed potatoes, carrots, bread and butter, apple pie, and milk. Dinner featured fried chicken, rice, green beans, cornbread, fruit salad, and coffee. That single day's menu totaled approximately 3,500 calories, more than German civilians received in 2 full days. The meat alone exceeded the monthly meat ration for an entire German family. Obergefreiter Hermann Richter, a former factory worker from the Ruhr, put it simply in his letters home: "I ate until I was sick. Then I ate more. We all did. Some men hid bread in their bunks, absolutely certain this abundance would vanish. The American guards would laugh and tell them there would be the same meal tomorrow and the day after. The prisoners didn't believe them. The food abundance in American POW camps accomplished what no propaganda campaign could have achieved. These soldiers had been taught that America was weak, divided, on the edge of collapse. Yet here they were eating better than Wehrmacht officers, while America simultaneously fought a war on two continents. The camp canteen opened their eyes to an entire world of consumer goods. With the 80 cents they earned daily for labor, prisoners could purchase items that had vanished from Germany years ago: chocolate bars, cigarettes, razor blades, soap, toothpaste, writing paper, and ice cream. Camp Hern's canteen sold 5,000 ice cream bars weekly to German prisoners who hadn't tasted ice cream since before the war. Gefreiter Fritz Müller wrote to his wife in astonishment, "Yesterday I bought ice cream." Ice cream. In Germany, even party officials cannot get ice cream, but here enemy prisoners buy it for 5 cents. The Americans have so much cocoa, they feed it to prisoners. The therapeutic feeding program for malnourished prisoners revealed medical abundance on a scale they'd never imagined. Prisoners received vitamin injections, nutritional supplements, and special diets to treat deficiency diseases. The camp hospitals contained more medical supplies than most German field hospitals had possessed. Penicillin, that miracle drug Germany couldn't produce, was used freely to treat prisoner infections. Dr. Heinrich Schmidt, a captured Wehrmacht medical officer, marveled at it all in his own journals. "They gave us vitamins in bottles, hundreds of pills, like candy. In Germany, we had no vitamins for our own wounded." Here, enemy prisoners received better medical care than German civilians could dream of. By October 1943, American farm labor shortages meant POWs were sent to work on farms and in food processing facilities. This exposure to American agricultural and industrial food production completed their ideological transformation. At a cotton gin outside Houston, prisoners watched mechanical harvesters do the work of 50 men in a single day. The gin processed more cotton daily than German textile mills saw in a month. But it was the casual waste that truly stunned them. Field workers, including African-American laborers whom Nazi ideology declared subhuman, ate lunches that would have been feasts in Germany. Thick sandwiches of beef or ham, whole apples, slices of pie, coffee with real cream. They threw away half-eaten food without thought. Unteroffizier Johann Kellner, working on a farm near Jackson, Mississippi, couldn't stop writing about it. "The Negro workers eat meat every day, white bread, fruit. One threw away a whole apple because it had a small bruise. In Germany, people would fight over that apple. At a Del Monte processing plant in California, prisoners saw truckloads of peaches turned into canned fruit, using technology that didn't exist in Germany. The plant processed more fruit in a single day than Germany imported in an entire year. Workers drank orange juice like water, and damaged fruit that would have been treasured back home was dumped by the ton into waste. Nothing shocked German POWs more than American meat consumption. In Germany, civilians received 250 grams of meat weekly when it was available at all. German soldiers were officially supposed to receive 150 grams daily, but rarely did. In American POW camps, prisoners received meat 2 or 3 times daily. The quality astounded them even more than the quantity. Not horse meat, not mysterious canned substances labeled meat, but actual recognizable cuts of beef, pork, and chicken. Camp Shelby in Mississippi, which held 5,300 German POWs at its peak, went through 14,000 pounds of meat each week. The butcher shop cut steaks, ground hamburger, and prepared roasts with a casualness that seemed almost criminal to men who had watched their families slowly starve. Obergefreiter Paul Fischer wrote about Sunday dinner with wonder. "Today for Sunday dinner we had roast beef, a slab as thick as my thumb. The Americans complained it was tough. In Germany, this would be wedding feast meat. My children have never seen such meat." Prisoners working at Swift & Company's meatpacking plant in Fort Worth witnessed the full scale of American industrial meat production. The plant processed 5,000 cattle every single day. Workers took home packages of beef that would have cost a German laborer a month's wages. "The waste was magnificent," wrote Hauptmann Kurt Zimmermann. "They discarded meat for having too much fat that would have been a treasure in Germany." One plant produced more meat in a week than Bavaria sees in a year. German POWs had survived for years on preserved vegetables, sauerkraut, pickled beets, and dried legumes. Fresh fruit had become memory, available only to party officials and the elite. In American camps, fresh produce arrived daily without fail. The psychological impact of fresh oranges at breakfast could hardly be overstated. Oranges, tropical fruit in June in Texas, available freely to enemy prisoners. The camps received regular shipments of apples, peaches, pears, grapes, and even bananas, fruit that most Germans hadn't seen since before the war began. Unteroffizier Wilhelm Becker wrote about it repeatedly. They gave us oranges at breakfast, not on special occasions, every day if we wanted them. The vitamin C cured my bleeding gums in a week. We ate more fruit as prisoners than German children see in a year. The vegetable variety seemed endless. Lettuce, tomatoes, corn, beans, peas, carrots, potatoes, onions, cabbage, squash. Fresh, not preserved in jars or cans. Camp Hearn maintained a 50-acre vegetable garden worked by prisoners who marveled at the productivity of American soil and farming methods. Working on farms, prisoners encountered agricultural abundance that challenged everything they thought was possible. In California's Central Valley, where some POWs were transferred for agricultural labor, they picked fruit in orchards that stretched for miles in every direction. They watched in disbelief as perfectly good fruit was discarded for minor blemishes or destroyed to maintain prices. In Germany, chocolate had disappeared by 1941, replaced by ersatz chocolate made from roasted acorns and beet sugar. Real chocolate had become rarer than gold. Sugar was rationed to 200 grams monthly for civilians. In American POW camps, chocolate and sweets appeared everywhere. The Camp PX sold Hershey bars, Baby Ruth, Snickers, Milky Way, brand names that would become legendary among returning prisoners decades later. The psychological impact of this casual availability of luxury foods cannot be understated. Obergefreiter Kurt Wagner wrote about his discovery. I bought 5 chocolate bars with one day's wages. In Germany, all the money in the world cannot buy one real chocolate bar. What kind of wealth allows enemies to buy chocolate daily? The camp kitchens baked desserts every day, pies, cakes, puddings. Sugar was used liberally in coffee, sprinkled on cereal, mixed into desserts. Prisoners, many having suffered years of sugar deprivation, initially made themselves sick on sweets. Milk, butter, cheese, cream, dairy products that had virtually disappeared from German diets appeared in abundance throughout American POW camps. Fresh milk came with every meal. Butter for bread, cheese sandwiches, ice cream. The calcium and protein from dairy products rapidly improved the prisoners' health. In Germany, milk had been reserved for small children and pregnant women when it was available at all. Butter had become a black market commodity. Cheese was a distant memory. At Camp Hearn, the dairy delivered 500 gallons of milk daily. Prisoners who hadn't tasted fresh milk in years drank it like medicine. Unteroffizier Franz Weber wrote simply, I drank a full glass of cold milk today. Real milk, not powdered substitute, not condensed. It tasted like everything precious, like memory itself, like home before the war took it away. German coffee by 1943 had become something else entirely. Roasted barley, acorns, chicory, bitter stand-ins that tasted nothing like coffee at all. American POW camps flowed with the real thing. Coffee, genuine coffee, unlimited and available. The psychological weight of this cannot be overstated for people who had grown up with coffee as the centerpiece of their daily rituals, their social gatherings, their entire understanding of civilization. The aroma rising from the pot each morning, the casual refills that appeared at breakfast, lunch and dinner, the simple luxury of cream and sugar stirred into every cup. These small acts of plenty struck like hammers against the entire Nazi narrative. Hauptmann Friedrich Zimmermann put it plainly in a letter. The Americans drink coffee all day long, real coffee from Brazil with cream and sugar. Back in Germany, my mother stretches 50 grams of ersatz coffee to last an entire month. Bread told a similar story. German bread by 1943 had become something barely recognizable. A dark, dense concoction made from rye, potato flour and sawdust, rationed to 2,000 grams weekly for those who did physical labor. When it arrived, it often came moldy. American POW camps served fresh white bread at every meal. The bakery at Camp Shelby produced 10,000 loaves each week, soft wheat bread so white, so tender, that German prisoners associated it with pure luxury. They could eat as much as they wanted. Gaffrater Paul Schmidt wrote home, "White bread, soft as cake, fresh every single day. We take as many slices as we want." Back in Germany, people are hanged for stealing bread. As prisoners were permitted to write letters home, those letters became weapons against everything the Nazi regime claimed. How could guards explain to families surviving on turnip soup that prisoners of war were eating meat 3 times daily? Many prisoners couldn't bring themselves to tell the truth at first, fearing they would crush their starving loved ones with the knowledge. Others sent their entire monthly wages to the black market, understanding that their pay could purchase things their families could never obtain through official ration cards. One letter intercepted by German censors from Feldwebel Fitzgerald Hoffmann read, "My beloved Greta, I am well and healthy here. Do not worry about me. The Americans possess more food than they can possibly use. I understand now why they fight. They are protecting something I thought existed only in dreams." What shocked German prisoners even more than the sheer volume of food was how the Americans responded to individual needs. Prisoners with medical conditions received special meals prepared just for them. Diabetics were given appropriate alternatives. Those suffering from ulcers received bland food that wouldn't aggravate their condition. This personalized care for enemy prisoners exceeded what German hospitals could manage for their own wounded soldiers. The Americans even tried to find foods familiar to German palates, procuring rye flour for dark bread, sauerkraut, and other preferences that reminded them of home. This respect for individual needs contradicted everything the Nazi system stood for. Dr. Wilhelm Braun, the senior German medical officer at Camp Shelby, observed, "The Americans spend more effort accommodating the dietary needs of enemy prisoners than the German military spends feeding its own soldiers." When prisoners were assigned to work on American farms, they received an education that would echo through the rest of their lives. Crop rotation, chemical fertilizers, machinery that did the work of dozens of men, irrigation systems that made deserts bloom. They witnessed agricultural yields that peacetime Germany could never have achieved. Working a wheat farm in Kansas, Obergefreiter Hermann Weber discovered that one American farmer with machinery could work 640 acres. Land that would have required an entire German village working together to farm. The combine harvester could process 100 acres of wheat in a single day. Weber wrote, "The American farmer I worked for produced more food than my entire district back in Bavaria." He did it with machines, with chemistry, with methods we had never imagined possible. November 25, 1943, brought something new. Thanksgiving dinner, a holiday the German prisoners didn't understand, but abundance they recognized instantly. The meal at Camp Herne that day arrived on the tables. Roasted turkey with stuffing, mashed potatoes covered in gravy, sweet potatoes topped with marshmallows, green bean casserole, cranberry sauce, fresh rolls with butter, pumpkin pie, apple pie, real coffee, and milk. Each prisoner received portions large enough to have fed a German family for an entire week. The turkey alone represented more meat than a German family could obtain in a year. Feldwebel Kurt Zimmermann wrote, "The Americans celebrated a holiday by serving enemy prisoners like royalty. If every American family ate this same meal, America is not a country, it is paradise itself." Prisoners working in American factories watched food preservation happen on an industrial scale Germany couldn't match. At the Campbell's soup plant in Camden, New Jersey, they witnessed the production of 10 million cans annually. Assembly lines ran without pause, filling cans with meat and vegetables that simply didn't exist in German supply chains. The technology alone astonished them. Automated peeling machines, continuous cookers, vacuum sealing equipment. But the quality control devastated them. Cans with small dents were rejected. The waste from imperfect products exceeded Germany's entire food production. Unteroffizier Fritz Müller wrote in shock, "They rejected entire pallets of canned goods because the labels were printed slightly off-center. Perfect food destroyed for cosmetic flaws." Ice cream became the final symbol of American excess. In Germany, before the war, ice cream had been rare, impossible during wartime. In American POW camps, ice cream was routine. Camp Shelby had an ice cream machine that produced 50 gallons daily during summer months. Prisoners could purchase ice cream bars, cones and cups at the canteen with their meager wages. The fact that prisoners of war ate ice cream while German children had never tasted it proved emotionally overwhelming. Obergefreiter Hans Meyer wrote, "I ate chocolate ice cream today." In Germany, this would be unimaginable even for wealthy families. Here, prisoners buy it for pocket change. The physical transformation documented by American medical officers was remarkable. Within 3 months of arrival, the average prisoner gained 25 to 30 pounds. Scurvy vanished. Night blindness disappeared. Protein deficiency healed. Major Robert Harrison, chief medical officer at Camp Shelby, reported, "The Germans arrived looking like victims from concentration camps, emaciated, diseased, mentally broken by starvation. 3 months of proper nutrition transformed them into healthy young men. The prisoners themselves could barely recognize themselves. Muscles returned to their bodies, energy surged. The mental fog from years of malnutrition lifted. They looked in mirrors and saw young men again, the men they had been before everything changed. Yet as their health improved and their stomachs filled, many experienced profound guilt about families left behind. How could they enjoy 3 meals daily while their children went hungry? The truth that American enemies fed them better than their own government fed their families was too painful to share. One letter discovered after the war read, "My dear wife, I cannot tell you the truth. I eat meat every day while you starve. I am safe while you are bombed. The Americans treat me better than our own government treats you." Christmas 1943 delivered another blow to their worldview. American church groups, civic organizations, and the Red Cross sent 500,000 Christmas packages to German prisoners. Each held chocolates, cookies, canned goods, cigarettes, and toiletries. Local communities added homemade items, hand-knitted scarves, hand-drawn cards, cookies baked by church ladies. The packages were given freely, regardless of rank or political background. This egalitarian generosity from enemies whose families were fighting and dying in Europe shattered whatever remained of Nazi racial ideology. Hauptmann Werner Klein wrote, "American civilians whose sons we were trying to kill months ago sent us Christmas gifts. Churches prayed for us. Children sent cards wishing us Merry Christmas. Only those absolutely certain of victory show such kindness to enemies." By early 1944, the food in American POW camps had become an unintended classroom. Prisoners learned about nutrition, vitamins, balanced diets, and food safety. They discovered that adequate nutrition improved not just health, but energy, mood, and clear thinking. Camp libraries stocked American agricultural journals and cookbooks. Prisoners studied American farming methods, food processing, and nutritional science. They learned that American abundance wasn't luck, but the result of scientific methods, mechanization, and efficient systems. Obergefreiter Friedrich Becker, who had studied agriculture before the war, wrote, "The Americans have transformed farming into pure science. They test soil, breed superior crops, use chemistry to increase yields. No wonder they possess so much food." As 1944 advanced and news from Germany worsened, the contrast became unbearable. Letters that bypassed the censors spoke of cities reduced to rubble, civilians eating grass soup, children dying from malnutrition. Meanwhile, German prisoners complained about repetitive menus. The moral foundation of Nazism crumbled faced with American abundance. How could the master race starve while their supposed inferiors wasted food? The black worker who collected their garbage ate better than German officers. The ideology was dead, killed by reality itself. Summer 1944 brought new shocks as prisoners worked through America's peak growing season. They picked peaches in Georgia, harvested vegetables in New Jersey, worked wheat fields in Kansas. The volume of food production overwhelmed them. In a single Georgia orchard day, prisoners picked peaches that could have fed a German city for a month. Perfect peaches were sorted by size and quality. Those slightly imperfect went to canaries. Damaged fruit was discarded or fed to pigs. Gefreiter Wilhelm Hoffmann wrote, We fed peaches to pigs today. Thousands of perfectly good peaches, too ripe for shipping, given to animals. In Germany, people would weep for such fruit. July 1944 at Camp Shelby brought a moment that captured everything about American plenty. Local farmers donated truckloads of watermelons for a 4th of July celebration. The German prisoners had never seen watermelons before. This exotic fruit simply didn't exist in their experience. Prisoners were given whole watermelons to share. Many didn't know how to eat them. Some prisoners wept at the sweetness, the abundance of pure sugar and water in fruit form. Unteroffizier Karl Schmidt wrote, "They gave us giant green fruits full of sweet red flesh. Each one could feed a family. The Americans ate the centers and threw away the rest. A nation that can waste food as amusement has already won." Work in Iowa cornfields provided another agricultural revelation. Iowa alone produced more corn than all of Germany, combined produced of all grains. Most shocking, most of it went to feeding animals, not people. The concept of growing crops specifically to feed to animals to produce meat was something Germany could never afford. In America, prime farmland was dedicated to producing animal feed, demonstrating agricultural abundance that seemed impossible. Feldwebel Hermann Fischer wrote, "The farmer explained that corn was mainly for pigs and cattle. They grow food to feed to animals to make meat. The Americans have so much grain, they can afford to convert it to meat." At a sugar beet processing plant in Colorado, German prisoners witnessed sugar production that defied everything they knew. Germany had severe sugar shortages, with civilians receiving 200 grams monthly. The Colorado plant processed 5,000 tons of sugar beets daily, producing mountains of white sugar. Workers at the plant received 5-pound bags of sugar as partial payment. They used sugar freely in coffee, on cereal, in baking. The casual consumption of pure sugar by ordinary workers provided another devastating comparison. Obergefreiter Paul Weber wrote, "I watched a worker pour half a cup of sugar into his coffee. This was 2 months of German sugar rations dissolved into a single cup of coffee." German prisoners working at Gulf Coast ports witnessed fishing fleets bringing in catches that dwarfed everything in German experience. Shrimp boats dumped tons of bycatch, perfectly edible fish thrown away simply because they weren't the target species. At Galveston, prisoners watched shrimpers throw away more fish in a day than German fishing fleets caught in a week. The idea of discarding food because it wasn't preferred was incomprehensible. Gaffreiter Hans Müller wrote, "They threw tons of fish back into the sea because they were the wrong kind." In Germany, people would fight over fish heads. Wisconsin dairy farms revealed milk production that seemed impossible. Single farms produced more milk daily than entire German districts. The equipment was decades ahead of anything in Germany. Mechanical milkers, refrigerated tanks, pasteurization systems. Most shocking was the casual waste. Milk that wasn't perfectly fresh was dumped onto fields. Cream was separated and used liberally. Butter was churned in quantities that would have supplied German cities. Unteroffizier Fritz Wagner wrote, "The farm where I work produces 1,000 gallons of milk daily. One farm, they pour excess milk onto fields as fertilizer. An egg farm in Maryland showed prisoners industrial egg production beyond their imagination. The farm housed 50,000 chickens, producing 40,000 eggs daily. Automated systems collected, washed and sorted them. Germans received 1 egg weekly on ration cards when available. American prisoners of war received eggs daily at breakfast." The Maryland farm shipped trainloads of eggs to cities across America. Gaffreiter Wilhelm Becker wrote, "Each chicken house held more birds than our entire village. They threw away more cracked eggs daily than Germany produces in total." When Thanksgiving arrived in 1944, the tables groaned under an abundance that seemed impossible given America's two-front war. The meal set before German prisoners of war told a story of extraordinary plenty. Turkey alongside ham, roast beef heaped on plates, mountains of mashed potatoes and sweet potatoes, stuffing drenched in gravy, green beans, corn, cranberry sauce. Then came 3 different pies, followed by ice cream, coffee, milk, and wine. The prisoners sat motionless, barely breathing. Back home, their families were starving, cities lay in ruins. Children were eating grass soup to survive. Yet here, in an American camp, German prisoners received a banquet that surpassed anything most had known before the war began. Hauptmann Werner Müller found words to capture his shock. The Americans possessed so much food they could feed enemies with feasts that exceeded what Germans ate during peacetime. Their abundance had conquered before armies ever crossed borders. By late 1944, many prisoners stopped writing home about the meals. The guilt had become too much to bear. Hidden diaries and unsent letters discovered after the war revealed something far worse than physical suffering. The psychological wounds cut deeper. Feldwebel Otto Schmitz had started a letter he never sent. In it, he described dreams of sending just one American meal to his family. The meat from a single lunch could sustain them for an entire week. He called his situation paradise while describing theirs as hell. When 1945 arrived and news of German collapse filtered into the camps, the contrast between two worlds became almost impossible to process. Prisoners ate their New Year's dinner while learning about the Ardennes offensive's failure. They sat in heated mess halls, reading newspapers showing starving German civilians, children with swollen bellies from malnutrition and rickets ravaging their bones. The faces in those photographs could have been their own relatives. Obergefreiter Hans Fischer recognized this horror. The newspaper showed German children eating grass soup, while he had eaten bacon for breakfast. His own little daughter was subsisting on grass while he sat with meat. The reality twisted something inside him. When Germany surrendered on May 8, 1945, German prisoners faced a cruel paradox they hadn't anticipated. The end of war meant eventually returning home, but home had become a wasteland of starvation and destruction. Many realized they didn't want to leave. The camps had transformed into refuges, sheltering them from the catastrophe waiting across the ocean. The American military recognized an opportunity to turn captivity into something constructive. Programs emerged to teach prisoners food production and preservation, knowledge they could carry back and use to rebuild their devastated nation. They learned canning techniques, farming methods, nutrition science, and food distribution systems. Major General Louis Beru, overseeing these operations, believed these men understood something crucial now. They had witnessed American abundance. They knew it could be achieved. As repatriation approached in late 1945 and early 1946, commanders faced a troubling reality. Prisoners would leave a world of plenty for a world of scarcity. Camp rations began decreasing gradually, preparing men for what awaited. They learned to forage, to make soup from minimal ingredients, to preserve food without refrigeration. The same facilities that had demonstrated abundance now taught the grim skills of survival amid scarcity. Dr. Wilhelm Hoffmann, the senior German medical officer, understood the danger. They had to teach their men to starve once more. Expanded stomachs might not tolerate the transition. Some prisoners might not survive the shock. Before departure, each camp organized final farewell dinners, with the Americans providing extraordinary feasts that exceeded even holiday meals. At Camp Shelby's farewell in February 1946, the menu became almost surreal in its generosity. Shrimp cocktail began the meal, followed by prime rib, lobster tail, baked potatoes topped with butter and sour cream, asparagus, Caesar salad, chocolate cake, ice cream, wine and coffee. Men wept openly, their shoulders shaking. These tears weren't from happiness, but from the crushing knowledge that they would likely never eat this way again. Hauptmann Friedrich Müller recorded his thoughts with raw emotion. Their final American meal surpassed every German feast he remembered. Tomorrow meant returning to turnip soup and bread made with sawdust. America had sent them home with full bellies and broken hearts. The train journey into Germany forced a reckoning. As they crossed the border, prisoners pressed faces against windows, staring at moonscapes of rubble and destruction. The landscape was alien, unrecognizable. At stations, skeletal civilians begged for food these former prisoners couldn't give. At Frankfurt, returning soldiers watched German civilians fighting over garbage discarded from Allied military trains. Children with distended starvation bellies pleaded for chocolate that no one possessed. Paul Weber wrote about this descent back to reality. They had returned to hell. His wife barely recognized him, too healthy, too well-fed compared to the walking skeletons surrounding them. His son, born while he served abroad, suffered from rickets caused by years of malnutrition. The shame was overwhelming, yet from this trauma emerged something unexpected. Former prisoners became essential to German recovery. They carried knowledge of American agricultural methods, food preservation techniques, and nutritional science. Understanding that abundance remained possible, they pushed for change. Many became leaders in German farming reform. They introduced mechanization, chemical fertilizers, and scientific farming methods they had observed in America. Hans Müller, once an Obergefreiter, became an agricultural advisor in Bavaria. He reflected on lessons learned in American fields that German schools had never taught. Science and democracy together created abundance, he realized. That simple truth changed everything. When the Marshall Plan was announced in 1947, former prisoners grasped its significance with an intensity most Germans couldn't match. They had experienced American generosity directly. They had witnessed casual waste that revealed unlimited resources. When food aid began arriving in Germany, it felt familiar. Wilhelm Schmidt, a former Feldwebel, recognized the irony. America was feeding them again, this time as free men rather than prisoners. Wheat, milk powder, canned goods, the same foods they had eaten in captivity, were now flowing to their entire nation. Studies conducted during the 1950s revealed something striking. German prisoners who had been held in American camps showed fundamentally different attitudes compared to those imprisoned elsewhere. They believed more strongly in democracy, supported economic cooperation, and held positive views toward America. The food experience had transformed them at a psychological level. These men had tasted abundance and wanted it for Germany. They had learned that prosperity came from production rather than conquest, from agricultural science rather than racial mythology. Dr. Hans Richter, studying former prisoners in 1955, reached a profound conclusion. The American camps had become inadvertent schools of democracy. Through full stomachs, prisoners had learned what their ideology had concealed, that democracy and capitalism could generate abundance that fascism only promised. As former prisoners aged through the 1960s and 1970s, many recorded their experiences. Their testimonies consistently pointed to food as the most psychologically transformative element of their captivity. Werner Hoffmann, once a Hauptmann, testified that Americans had defeated them with food before armies arrived. Every meal carried a lesson about American power. They had surrendered to abundance long before surrendering to Eisenhower. Kurt Möller, a former Unteroffizier, reflected that he had learned more about America from its food than from its books. The casual waste revealed surplus. The variety revealed choice. During the 1980s, former German prisoners began returning to America for reunions. They visited camps now repurposed for different uses, met with former guards, and reconnected with Americans who remembered them. At a 1985 gathering at Camp Shelby, Hans Weber, once a prisoner there, brought German beer to share with American veterans. He raised his glass with emotion. The Americans had fed them when they were enemies. They had shown abundance when prisoners knew only scarcity. They returned to Germany with full bellies and new dreams. An American guard, Robert Johnson, responded simply, "We just fed you what we ate ourselves, nothing special. That's simply America." Nothing special, he suggested, that might seem miraculous to those who had endured want. The numbers starkly illustrated the contrast between nations. German civilians from 1943 to 1945 received weekly bread rations of 2,000 grams, meat of 250 grams when available, fats of 100 grams, and monthly sugar of 200 grams. Adults received no milk, eggs were rare, daily calories ranged between 1,200 and 1,700. German prisoners in American camps ate unlimited bread, 350 grams of meat daily, butter and fats daily, unlimited sugar in coffee and desserts, 1 quart of milk daily, and eggs at breakfast. They consumed 3,500 to 4,000 calories every single day. Beyond quantity, quality diverged dramatically. German rations contained ersatz substitutes, spoiled supplies, and sawdust fillers. American rations were fresh, varied, and exceeded German pre-war standards. Psychological studies conducted after the war identified something remarkable. German prisoners experienced cognitive reconstruction through consumption. Daily exposure to abundance forced fundamental revision of beliefs about American society, German superiority, and national strength. Dr. Friedrich Braun's 1950 study described it provocatively. The prisoners underwent involuntary ideological conversion through ingestion. Every meal contradicted Nazi propaganda. They weren't brainwashed, but rather belly-washed, converted through consumption rather than coercion. This transformation proved particularly profound because it was experiential. Prisoners didn't merely read about American abundance, they ate it. They didn't hear descriptions of agricultural might, they harvested it with their own hands. Former prisoners introduced American food culture to post-war Germany. They shared recipes learned in mess halls, cooking techniques from farm wives, and most importantly, the conviction that abundance remained achievable. The first German supermarkets of the 1950s were modeled on American stores described by former prisoners. The concept of food choice, aisles stocked with variety, refrigerated sections, frozen foods, all flowed from captivity experiences. Even American fast food's eventual triumph in Germany was partly prepared by former prisoners who remembered hamburgers, hot dogs, and ice cream from their imprisonment. They had tasted casual abundance and wanted it for their country. At the last major reunion of German former prisoners in 1995, marking 50 years since war's end, 89-year-old Otto Müller delivered the keynote address. His words carried the weight of someone reflecting on a complete transformation. They had arrived as warriors of the master race, convinced of superiority, certain of victory. They departed as chastened men who had dined at democracy's table. The Americans hadn't fed them from cruelty, showing them what they couldn't possess. They had shared from generosity, offering what they had in abundance. Every meal became a lesson. Every full belly became an education. American strength resided not in armies, but in agriculture, not in weapons, but in wheat, not in ideology, but in ice cream. Yes, ice cream, that impossible luxury that American prisoners ate daily while German children starved. They returned home with knowledge more valuable than military secrets. They knew abundance remained possible because they had consumed it. They understood democracy worked because they had digested its fruits. They recognized peace mattered more than war because they had tasted both. To those Americans who fed them, gratitude filled their hearts. They had conquered prisoners with kindness, defeated enemies with generosity, converted skeptics with coffee and cream. The prisoners who arrived as foes departed as ambassadors of American abundance. The food shared during their imprisonment became the foundation of friendship as allies. They were fed when hungry, shown mercy when deserving judgment, and taught that strength lies in giving rather than taking. They had eaten democracy, and it transformed them permanently. The audience, American veterans, German veterans, their families, stood in standing ovation, united by memory of when enemies became friends over food, when hatred dissolved in hospitality, when war ended not with vengeance but with vitamins. This story stands as one of history's most remarkable examples of unintentional psychological transformation. Without planning or propaganda, America conquered enemies through the straightforward act of feeding them well. More than 425,000 German prisoners passed through American camps, with 371,683 at peak capacity. They experienced collective transformation through consumption. Nazi warriors arrived, witnesses to democratic abundance left. Men believing in German superiority departed, knowing American prosperity. Enemies entered, future allies exited. American POW camp meals did more than sustain bodies. They changed minds. Every generous portion undermined Nazi ideology. Every dessert demolished propaganda. Every glass of milk destroyed myths of American weakness. Prisoners were defeated not by deprivation, but by abundance, not by cruelty, but by kindness. America's greatest weapon proved not the atomic bomb, but apple pie. Not the Sherman tank, but the chocolate bar. Not the B-17 bomber, but beef steak. German prisoners were conquered by consumption, defeated by dessert, vanquished by vegetables. They had expected to find a weak, divided nation collapsing. Instead, they discovered an agricultural colossus capable of feeding enemies better than Germany fed its citizens. They witnessed democracy's arsenal, but more importantly, they tasted democracy's abundance. The transformation proved complete and permanent. These men returned not as defeated adversaries, but as converts to prosperity, advocates for abundance, witnesses to possibility. They had glimpsed the future, and it was delicious. Their experience reminds us that greatest victories sometimes occur not on battlefields but in mess halls, not through destruction, but through generosity, not by breaking bodies but by filling them. German prisoners learned that democracy's supreme strength wasn't capacity for destruction, but ability to create, not power to punish, but capacity to provide. They arrived hungry and departed full, not merely of food, but of new possibilities for what their nation could become. In their transformation lay the seeds of the Atlantic Alliance, the Marshall Plan, and the peaceful, prosperous Germany that would emerge from destruction. Men who had marched for the Third Reich returned as apostles of agriculture, prophets of prosperity, and witnesses to what a society could achieve when turning enemies into friends through the simple revolutionary act of sharing its abundance. They had tasted America, and they would never be the same.